But I want to just talk a little bit about why I wrote this book before you buy it, you take it home and you read it and you can kind of process it later. One of my main reasons was because I grew up in one paradigm, one way of thinking, and I had this awakening experience in 2016 while we were living in Washington, D.C. And after that, I changed so many things. And I want people to feel like it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to grow up one way and change your mind and think differently. I didn't realize that the thoughts that I was having in my head that were kind of on repeat were actually there by my choice. And when I realized that I could choose the things that I was thinking, choose my beliefs, my belief system, I could control. It wasn't even really about control. I realized that my awareness of my thoughts gave me the ability to decide if I even wanted to have them or not. And so I learned over this past couple years about this idea of awareness and how being able to objectively look at your thoughts. I talk about it in my book, but I learned all that through vlogging, because you're holding a camera and when you look at yourself on TV, you're getting that perspective. And so I learned a lot through that process, and being one of the silly things that happened recently was making these macaroons. So I talk about in the book when my daughters and I went to Paris, and the story in the book is about how the chef really underestimated my girls because we are very talented bakers. But something that I realized just this past week, when we went to France, we learned how to make Italian macaroons. And now I actually made French macaroons. And I thought, these are way too easy. The French ones, you didn't have to cook anything. You didn't have this very delicate process. I was like, this is just too easy. They can't taste okay and still be this easy. And so I was, realizing that I was really creating this idea that making macaroons were supposed to be hard. And then I had this experience this week where I was just making them and I'm like, this is so easy. And the fact that I sort of had this awareness on my situation, and it doesn't have to be something huge. It doesn't have to be church and religion, but having this awareness through everything that you do throughout the day, throughout your life, gives you that objective perspective. So now I can make macaroons and not have the stress that I had trying to make these Italian macaroons, which is weird because we were in Paris and we learned how to make Italian macaroons. And this idea of, being able to observe your thoughts really changed, it changed a lot, because I feel like I was always really trying hard and never achieving what I wanted to achieve. But what I didn't realize was all the while, it was just the thoughts that I was having in my head. Like, I use a quote often. I believe it's a Buddhist quote, but I actually used it this morning on our drive to school. But it's the idea that pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, because suffering is the mind's added stress that it's just adding to the situation. So one of the things with our thoughts, the second kind of piece of this puzzle that I had in my awareness, was needing to have the bandwidth, the space in my life to be able to grow and expand. So my awakening happened while I was in Washington, D.C. That allowed me personally to have a clear schedule. I didn't have all the requirements of church and school and friends and people coming over and anything. I didn't have anything, and that allowed me the space physically, mentally, emotionally to be able to take on and to expand and grow. And I feel like a lot of times in the culture that we're on this hamster wheel of thoughts, of activities, of TVs being on incessantly, that we don't give our minds the space to be able to think new thoughts, to try new things in our life. Like sometimes, I can't remember who it was, I think it was my sister, she said, I'm not gonna do this extra activity this year. And that allowed her extra time to fill up with the next activity. And I said, why don't you just wait? Just give it a minute. Don't fill it up, because when you have that space, you're open, something new might walk through the door that you really weren't available to see or understand, because you were on this, hamster wheel of never taking the time to slow down. And I talk about that a lot with my kids. I have especially social children that always like to be going and doing activities, and I always say, just stay home for like an hour or two. Like, just chill. Because I feel like that is part of what's going to help us grow mentally, physically, spiritually, and be able to expand into what we are meant to be. And I also feel like our children are the future. Like, we know that they're our future, but I feel like a lot of what I had circling in my mind were programs from my parents, my culture, things that I picked up that I really didn't objectively choose. And so with our children, I feel like we need to help them to see, help them to make some space in their life, especially obviously with cell phones and the lives that we lead. The go, 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 and if you have 17 things on your agenda this week, like, you get the gold star from the neighborhood. But really, we need to help our kids to expand. And I talk about parenting a little bit in the book, but I feel like I'm very passionate about that, because we're often bringing habits and patterns from our parents that they didn't consciously choose to us, that we're not really objectively consciously choosing, and then we're passing on to our kids and never stopping to say, hold on, does this really work? Is this really gonna be good for us? Is this really gonna be good for the planet? I love the quote by JFK that says, a rising tide lifts all the boats. And I feel like our children are the ones who are lifting the boats in our culture, because especially millennials kind of aren't taking any crap. Like, they're thinking for themselves, I would say, a lot more than people my age have been. And I have a funny story. Like, for a couple summers ago, I made up this game with my kids, and the idea was to kind of help them break this idea of the outcome. I don't think I consciously knew it at the time, but it really worked well for this, because as parents, I think we put those expectations on our kids for our preference of how they turn out or what they're like. And so I made up this game with my children, and it was a long summer day, and I think I was at the end of my rope. I said, let's get in the car. We're playing a new game. And I just made it up as I went along. It was called Left, Left, Right. Really a good name, I know. And I said, okay guys, we're gonna drive, and I'm gonna just call on you to tell me a direction that we're gonna turn. And so I would turn, say, okay, honey, tell me, we're just like driving, and then when I said, tell me left or right, you just had to say left or right. And we ended up, I don't know where, somewhere to eat probably, but the idea was that it helped them break their attachment to the outcome of like, where are we gonna go, and all the fights or arguments or trying to make the decision about it. But I feel like it was a really good way to kind of demonstrate making space. It's like a really good analogy for all of these things that I want to incorporate in my life and my parenting now. But they still kind of talk about it today, and it was just a silly game, but it helped them to, you know, really, I think, hit home with a lot of these little things that I was teaching them, or that I am teaching them now. And then I think that the last thing, and I talk about this a lot in my book, is the patterns that we are passing down consciously or unconsciously. And in my more recent studies, I talk a lot about Carl Jung, who is an analytical psychologist. He developed the persona and the introvert and extrovert, and the father of analytical or depth psychology. And he talks a lot about unconscious and conscious. And awareness is like bringing consciousness to something. You're bringing your conscious awareness to it. A lot of the things that we're passing down from generation to generation are the unconscious. So Carl Jung talks a lot about the unconscious and the conscious, and how for us to really individualize and to become the whole version of you, you have to integrate that, the unconscious things, which are often called shadow, or the negative kinds of aspects that are either passed down, or I talk about pain body in my book also, which is a spiritual term that Eckhart Tolle uses. But the idea of integrating our unconscious and our conscious, and really it's bringing it to the light. It's like this idea of flashing a flashlight on to some of these behaviors. And so I feel like this whole awakening that I went through, I want to help other people to understand, you know, an awakening doesn't have to be like mine was kind of like a midlife crisis that just sort of evolved, and finally I learned some lessons and got past it. But it could be something small, it could be something that you're facing in your life. It could just be a decision, or it could be something like health related, like a stroke or a cancer diagnosis, like that wakes you up and really brings something to light. And so I hope that if you get my book and you read it, I hope that it can help you also to navigate through an awakening in your life from my example. And then some at the end, I start maybe teaching some practical conscious practices that you can implement in your life. So